Welcome you to an oral history interview. This is Jay Albanese, and I'm pleased to be with distinguished criminologist Jan van Dijk from the Netherlands. And we are in Budapest, Hungary, at the meetings of the European Society of Criminology. And the oral history interviews has as a purpose to find orally to learn about the life and careers and thinking of well-known criminologists around the world. So I'm very pleased to be with Jan van Dijk today. And let's start at some of the beginnings. It was back in the 1970s. You got a law degree from University of Leiden. Correct. And then it was after that you decided to do a PhD in criminology. What provoked you to do that?
Yeah, well, there were mainly push factors more than pull factors. I was destined to become a partner in a law firm in Amsterdam, like my father. That's why I went to law school at Leiden, which was very prestigious in those days. Maybe it still is. But I was thrown off course by the political climate of that time. So people from my generation were honestly not motivated to become rich lawyers. We wanted to be involved in politics, in reforming society. That was quite normal. It's not me personally that had that idea. That was the culture. Mm-hmm. So I was looking for ways to get out of this career pattern of a lawyer, of a commercial lawyer. And criminology was one of the few options in the law faculty to become involved in social research and philosophy, because that is taught in Europe in the law faculty. And certainly in Leiden there was a fairly well-known professor in criminology, Willem Nagel. So I started to take courses with him, and I did my final thesis on criminology.
I see. Okay.
It was an escape.
So you abandoned the traditional law firm route.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so rather than become a wealthy attorney, you became a poor criminologist.
That's exactly what happened in the rural areas in the Netherlands, because I went to Nijmegen University as a junior lecturer in criminology. After I got my degree.
I see.
And from then on, I've been a criminologist.
Yeah, from that point on.
Yeah.
And so you began your career as an academic, but then you were attracted to join the government.
Absolutely.
Now, how did that come about?
Well, another well-known Dutch criminologist became director of a newly established research center, an in-house research center within the Ministry of Justice. And he asked me and some other young scholars to come over to help him to build up this adventurous in-house criminology gypsy camp kind of center within a very traditional Ministry of Justice, which was run by lawyers and so on.
Right, and well, that's a very important mind change, because to have a traditional Ministry of Justice that prosecutes criminals and does criminal law procedure as a focus, to get them involved in criminology, crime prevention, bigger picture issues. What do you think was the driving force behind moving in that direction?
Yes, I have a clear idea about that. I think they were panicking because of the increasing crime rates, and the lawyers there felt something's going on here, but we don't have the answer. They didn't know how to respond. Politicians wanted a program, a response, but the top lawyers at the ministry said, "We have no idea, what should we do?" So that's why they asked Wouter Doekhuizen, who was a professor of criminology in Groningen, to set up this center. They really needed help to formulate a clever response to the rising crime problems in the Netherlands. And what is now so interesting, exactly the same happened in the United Kingdom. In the same years, Ron Clark was asked to become the chief scientist at the Home Office in London for exactly the same reasons. The rising crime in England, the top officials in the Home Office being at a loss what to do.
Yeah.
And that's why Ron also became extremely successful in building up the so-called research and planning unit in the Home Office in London, in exactly the same years that we were doing similar things in The Hague.
I see. Oh, okay, yeah, that really is important.
And we became very good friends, of course, and mutually reinforced each other. We had annual exchange visits between London and The Hague, and many professional friendships were forged between me and Ron, but also between me and Ben Mayu and others at the Home Office.
Yeah, it was a fascinating time in history for criminology, because that's when...
And it was big money for us. It was big money. We didn't know how to spend it. We had so much money. Because they wanted us to help them. And money was not an issue at all. There was no economic crisis either. It was money was booming.
But you had to come up with the ideas for programs.
Absolutely, yeah. But that was not so difficult. I mean, the traditional criminal justice system was not very effective. That was clear.
Yeah.
So we did research on treatment programs in prisons, alternative sanctions, and then we moved, and that was really very important, into crime prevention programs, social crime prevention, situational crime prevention, and victim assistance was also, in a way, developed, designed in those years, mid-80s, mid-1980s. And again, very parallel tracks between Ron Clark and his team and us in The Hague. Same agenda.
Yeah.
Sometimes they were a little bit ahead of us, but we started the victimization surveys in Europe in 1973 because there was an interest to know what is going on in terms of crime, and we told them that you should do an annual victimization survey. Then you will know.
Right.
That's what happened.
And how were you able to sell the idea of the victimization survey? Because they're always so widely criticized for being so expensive. So how are you able to sell the idea? Was the money just available to do it, or?
I have no recollection at all that we had to search for or fight for the money. No. We had to convince them that the police statistics were not reliable, and we did. I mean, we showed them that this can't be true. And then it was, well, we out-contracted it to a Poland company, and it was done. And has been going on ever since in the Netherlands. We have a huge annual victimization survey still in the field.
Right, and that was the impetus for the International Crime Victim Survey, ultimately, to broaden that out to many more cities and countries. That the idea is that the only way to get a reliable count of what's going on is through victimization surveys, regardless of the difficulty in administering the survey itself. So when you did your work with the Dutch government, that went on for how many years? Were you?
Well, between 75 and 95, so a major chunk of my career was at this center. When I look back at my career, I sometimes feel maybe I spent too much time in administration. Because I became very much involved also in drafting policy papers. Again, because the lawyers felt they needed and the same happened in London. So that, of course, takes away a lot of your energy and time, because I became involved also a little bit in politics.
Sure.
But when I look back at it, it's because I had that position in the Ministry of Justice and had very good relationships with the ministers also. When I had this idea of the International Crime Victim Survey, I told the minister, I have done so much for you, now you do something for me. You write a personal letter to all the ministers of justice in Europe, inviting them to take part in this wonderful idea of Jan van Dijk to do an international victimization survey, and he did. And that really triggered the International Crime Victim Survey. Some of the countries have only participated because the minister got a letter from his peer from The Hague. And that you can never do when you have a purely academic career.
Right.
So that was my bonus, and this is what I got back from him for all these years of speech.
Well, yeah, that is very true, because a criminologist working from a university would never get that.
Nowadays, no chance in hell.
Yeah, so it is interesting that first of all, the government becomes interested in criminology, facing a need to look at crime from a much broader picture. It wasn't being prosecuted out of existence, we need to do something else. And then it was through that position that you were able to not only start the victimization survey, but actually expand it internationally.
Worldwide, yes. Yeah, we had the goodwill and also the resources.
Yeah.
Because the ICVS was partly funded by the development aid program of the Netherlands. And of course I knew these people, these were in my network.
Right.
So the fact that we could also carry out a survey in many African countries, Latin American countries, and Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
We funded the first surveys in Eastern Europe with Dutch money.
Oh, I see.
And again, as a professor, that would have been out of reach.
Right, there's no way you would ever, will have the resources, never mind the connection.
The network in The Hague and things like that.
Right, to
the trust.
yeah.
So that was I was fortunate in that respect, but I had to work hard for that. I mean, it's not so easy to survive as you will know also. Yes, in a political environment, you have to sell parts of your soul.
Well, you have to gain the trust of government officials as a criminologist that you knew what you were doing and why this was important. Then to get them to be willing to go out on a limb to try to sell it to other countries internationally. It's amazing. Yeah, they have to trust in your judgment, and that takes years of support that you build up.
Investing in these pleasures.
Yeah, exactly.
Building up your position.
Yeah. Okay, and then in the 1990s, was it the late 90s, when you decided to go to the UN?
Yes, that was 1998, I think. Yes.
All right. And what provoked that move on your part?
I got a call from Pino Malacchi, who was an Italian professor specializing in organized crime. I didn't know him that well personally, but we knew each other's existence. And he knew that I had been head of the Dutch delegation to many of these meetings in Vienna on crime and crime prevention. I went there annually.
Right.
And was generally supportive on my issues, on victim assistance, on crime prevention, not so much on organized crime at the time, although that became also an issue in the Netherlands in the late 90s. So I got a call from Pino whether I would be interested to join him and his team in Vienna. I had some hesitations because I had friends in the staff in Vienna and they were not so happy with him.
Yeah.
But I thought maybe I can be the bridge builder or the person who can make this a success, because I had friends in the existing staff, among the existing staff. So that's why I went. Also because they really wanted me to come. There was a vacancy and they had tense relationship with Alaki, so they also felt maybe this is a very good move.
Yeah.
I had grossly overestimated my power in that environment. I thought I can handle the behavior to a point, because that was really different.
Yes, well, the UN is a massive bureaucracy, very well, as you know, very large organization, and but you were able to accomplish quite a bit over the years.
In the first years, yes.
Yeah.
I still had some room. Yeah. And I ignored the backstabbing part of it, because I was extremely motivated. I was extremely motivated to make this work.
Yeah.
So I worked very, very hard. I recruited many young people, all of them with PhDs, which was extraordinary, because most of them were career UN diplomats at that time. I don't think there was anyone with a PhD when I joined, but when I left, most of the staff had PhDs. Some of them left with me, of course, as these things go, but some of them are still there.
Yeah.
Still there. Some of the younger people are still there. So yes, I gave it quality push.
Yeah, it seems during the years you were there, the UNODC, which it became, UN Office on Drugs and Crime, started to develop a capacity for doing assessments that is, well, as you suggest, onboard expertise there increased dramatically.
Yeah.
So rather than the UN being an information agency, UN was doing analysis, at least in terms of crime.
I had a journal.
We began with the
journal
first
in
one.
all the 5 languages.
Yeah.
The first journal probably on criminology in Arab and in Chinese. I'm sure
It might be the journal, yeah.
It was not announced.
No, they haven't been publishing it in recent years. No.
Unfortunately.
But yeah, you would need, with the size of the bureaucracy, you would need someone with your energy and reputation to push that constantly, because in that bureaucratic environment, it's very, very difficult. Now, did you find in your career, some people have said that the big change occurred when, like the annual UN Crime Commission, rather than sending experts on crime, the member states increasingly sent folks from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Absolutely.
And it became much more of a political.
It was taken over by the diplomats.
Yeah.
And nowadays we have reached a stage where NGOs are not even allowed into the room. That's as far as that. And in the old days, university professors also working for NGOs were key players.
Yeah.
And this is the downside of the success of the crime commission. Transnational organized crime and certainly terrorism became so politically important that they didn't want any experts around anymore. It was too important for experts. And that's really what happened. Before, crime was about household burglary and vandalism. So I'm saying that you can leave to the professors, but then it's about security. You don't trust these people. You want your own diplomats with clear instructions from the capital.
Yes.
And that's exactly what happened. So it really became an important issue. Even maybe the most important issue at one point, security, national security, certainly in your country.
Sure.
So then you can understand that the State Department wants to have full control. I even remember talking about your country that the people from State Department didn't even trust the officials from the Ministry of Justice, from the Department of Justice. They felt them already to be experts. That should be in the margins. It was the State Department that wanted full control.
Yes, and then what happens? You get almost a complete reversal. Rather than relying on expertise to drive policy, policy drives itself without the benefit of the input of experts, and it becomes an exercise in foreign relations rather than an exercise in crime control and criminal justice.
Yes, and a sad example of that is that we had great expectations that when the UN would adopt conventions or treaties on organized crime, on human trafficking, the UN would also be mandated to do the monitoring of the implementation of those treaties.
Right.
And actually these treaties have very interesting provisions about all that, but that never happened. Because again, these issues are too important for independent monitoring. The countries can't agree on that, they don't trust each other. So there is no monitoring about human trafficking done by the UN, unfortunately.
Now, you can argue that a big threshold as the UN was the passage of the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime.
Yes.
That was a very important threshold for the UN because it's a binding agreement, and the enforcement of it is still being meted out. You should know the Conference of Parties meets, and
It needs.
it's a very, very difficult kind of thing. How do you think, first of all, consensus was able to be reached on a lot of contentious issues about organized crime and the protocols on trafficking and smuggling and firearms, right? I mean, that from where I sit, that's almost a breakthrough to get that level of international consensus on issues like that.
And also the willingness to exchange information on trends in organized crime.
Yeah.
That's all in the convention. In cooperation with the academic community, even that is in the text of the convention. But it never materialized, and again, this has become, because it became too important, and particularly what I have, because I was there, I was around 9/11 in Vienna, and within a week, the interests, of course, shifted from organized crime to terrorism. There was still, and the links between it, but particularly terrorism. And then they even felt maybe we should not discuss this here in Vienna, let's discuss it in the Security Council. And that's also what happened. But that has not worked out to the advantage of the implementation of the convention. Terrorism became the big issue. You would expect human trafficking is still there's still a lot of attention for human trafficking, but even there's no monitoring. There's no monitoring at all. There's no involvement of NGOs.
Right, yeah. And that probably has been the biggest problem. I think when you look at the convention itself and the protocols, you say, well, this is really landmark to get this kind of global consensus on these kinds of issues. But the implementation is obviously where the action is, and that's where things have slowed down.
Absolutely, yes. Globally, certainly. So as researchers, maybe that's what I have learned. There are windows of opportunity for criminology, political windows of opportunity. So when the lawyers lost their self-confidence in the mid-1980s, then there was that window. When they became interested in organized crime as the downside of globalization, there was also a window of opportunity for some academics. For the moment, there is for us there is a window of opportunity in Brussels, because the European Union still has the potential to become important also in the criminal justice domain, and they also need academic input. So many interesting projects are funded by Brussels nowadays.
Yes, it would seem, even if you look around the world, you could argue that the EU is funding the most interesting research, policy relevant, crime and justice research, around the world. All kinds of interesting.
Yeah, and also here in Eastern Europe, they have really. I think they still play a very positive role in funding all kinds of projects. For instance, on human trafficking here in the new member states, in Bulgaria, Romania, here in Hungary. The EU has played a positive role there in promoting the criminology in Europe.
Yeah. Now, one interesting thing about your career, you spent quite a bit of time, as we said, in the Dutch government and in the United Nations. But all throughout that time, you maintained an active record of writing and publishing, and it's very difficult because in those organizations you have a lot of bureaucratic administrative duties. How are you able to find the time to also author reports as well as handle administrative duties?
Yeah, I had developed the discipline to work in the evening. So when a light dinner, and then I go back to my study, and I did that already when I was just starting in the Ministry of Justice, working in the evening and at night. So that was how I, not during the day, that is indeed impossible in a political environment, but I worked in the evening. When I look back at my publications from all those years, I agree with you, they are there. I find them, I can see that they're all done in the evening. I think my recent writing is a little bit more sophisticated because I have more time.
Right.
I never had the time to do a third round of editing where you really make it more edgy. Right. And you can see that, I think, in those. They are typically evening based articles and papers. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Because that is rare, because you see criminologists whose careers go back and forth between government and academia. Government is a very full-time job, and it's very difficult to then have the time and energy to actually do writing.
Yeah, well, this is what happened. Yeah. I'm also fairly fast. I mean, I don't need that much time.
Yeah.
That will certainly have helped.
I see. And now you left the UN in what year was that?
2000.
2005. Okay, and what provoked you to go back to academia?
Then there was a clear pull factor. They just offered me a wonderful chair. There was a foundation in Holland associated with the royal family who wanted a chair on victim assistance and on victims issues. And one of my good old friends in Holland maneuvered in such a way that the faculty in Tilburg University was given that chair. And then it was again a phone call, Jan, would you be interested to come over? Otherwise I would not have come back at that time, because I was starting some new things in the UN.
Sure.
But this was a dream come true, because I always felt that within criminology I can go on, but it would be very nice to spend the final part of my career focusing on victims' issues.
Sure.
And this was a fantastic offer, because it was a research chair.
Right.
I could do teaching if I wanted, but there was no obligation to do any teaching. So too good to be true. So I said, okay, yes, when? And I left within 2 months.
Right. Okay.
Which was a bit harsh to the UN colleagues.
Sure.
I really thought this is once in a lifetime.
Right.
And it was a good decision, because I've been extremely happy with being for the first time in my life a full-time academic. Just in the morning sitting what I'm going to do now.
Yes, exactly.
Deciding on your own time.
Right, and you have time to read and think more than you do when you're with government or with the UN.
Absolutely.
Because there's always crises in governments and UN. There's always fires to put
everywhere.
Yes. Everywhere, whether it's people or budgets or whatever it happens to be, it gets crazy. So now you've written many things over your career. One thing that some viewers might not be aware of is your introductory criminology text that you wrote. The first edition was in the 1990s when you first went. I'm trying to remember when it first came out. Your criminology text in Holland, which is now in, I don't know, what edition is it in?
We're working on the 8th.
Yeah, so it's been like extremely successful.
Yes, yeah. It's a small language area. Otherwise, I would be a millionaire. But within the Dutch language, it's been very successful.
Yeah.
And this started in I think 1990.
Yeah, and well, that had to be one of the first of its kind for in terms of organizing the field.
And at that time there was no textbook. No, there had been textbooks from just after the war, but no, there was no Dutch textbook.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still the only one, I think. And this is partly because criminology was extremely polarized. So we had the critical radical criminology and the more mainstream criminology, positivistic.
Right.
And for a textbook you need to be balanced, even-handed. You can never be totally even-handed, because then it becomes very boring. But I put it together. It is a textbook, I think, that gives equal attention to different schools. Mm-hmm. And then of course there is your own bias, which in my case is situational crime prevention.
Sure.
So that slips in here and there, but it is used by most of the Dutch universities, regardless of their particular theoretical orientation.
Right. Yeah, it is very, very well known in Holland. Now, when you went back to Tilburg, went back to university. Within a few years, the book "The World of Crime" was published by Sage.
Yes.
And that seems to be. I've read it, of course. It seems a book that really pulls together a lot of what you've worked on in terms of victimization surveys and crime prevention, and what was your objective in that book?
That book is, I think, a reflection on what I learned during my UN years. So I would never have been able to write that book or been motivated to write such a book without my 7 years with the United Nations, because it has a global outlook. On every topic. I look for what does this mean for Africa or for Asia. As a Dutch professor, I would never have such a broad outlook. So I am certainly indebted to my UN years for that book. So for me, it's the fruit of the years in the Journal of the United Nations.
Yeah.
Not more than and of course the academic environment in Tilburg gave me the rest to finish it, but it's based on my work in the United Nations.
Yeah.
Clearly so.
And one thing I also find remarkable about your career, given the fact that a large piece of your career was at the UN and with the Dutch government, you were able to be a productive writer as well. So people were familiar with you in your work. You received an awful lot of recognition over the year. Many awards, prizes from the American Society of Criminology, the Victimology Society, and of course culminating last year with the Stockholm Prize. What is your reaction to that, for the fact that there's a lot of people who seem to notice the work you've done?
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure, and it also, in the case of the Stockholm Prize, has certainly boosted interest in my work, which is also good from my perspective. So that is all very, very positive. It's not true that my career has always been easy sailing. That I want to stress. That's not the case. I particularly in my own country, much more than among my American colleagues and friends, I was often criticized for collaborating with these nasty people in the Ministry of Justice.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So I was even sometimes really a little bit in the margins of the academic in a circle. They didn't see me as an equal because I was working for the government.
Oh, I see.
So in that respect, it is quite gratifying for me that at the end of my career, or later parts of my career, I got this recognition. Almost exclusively outside my own country. I do notice that. There are no awards from my own wonderful kingdom.
It's interesting how that works in life. Yes, the further away you get from home, the more you appreciate it.
Yeah, particularly also in the United States, they have always given, maybe also because they didn't know exactly what I was doing in the Hague, the Ministry of Justice, which is true. I was not in the American media as a minister or something, or as a speechwriter or something. So that was my good luck. So maybe I became so international oriented also for that reason. I felt more at ease abroad than in my own country, where I was indeed a highly politicized person and not an independent academic in the eyes of the others.
Right. And as you said, you wouldn't have been able to accomplish a lot of what you have accomplished.
That's absolutely true. No way.
Without that government position.
Yeah. So it was an investment that eventually has worked out well for my academic career. Right. But it is a bit extraordinary to spend so much time in administration and government when you really what you really want to be is a scholar, because that was my choice. Right. As a student, I said I'm not going into this law firm. I want to become a scholar with some impact on society.
Right, because when you look at some other criminologists around the world who've gotten into government or have gotten into academic administration, in most cases they vanish from the research arena. mainly to do the demands of their position, and they aren't able to keep up their research and their writing. But you are one of the few who was able to do that. And for me, the interesting thing is, I think your work is as well known in the U.S. as it is in Europe, and I think it goes to one, your international perspective, your pioneering role with the crime victimization survey, and your big role in studies of victims, victimology. Those are huge contributions that I think everybody is aware of. And the ironic thing is, as you are right, even in the U.S., oftentimes academics who work for the government are saying, "What are you doing working for the government? That's not right." And but in fact, that's how often you get things done. You get if you get the ear of the right people and the trust of the right people, you can make some significant changes. And that's what you were able to do.
Raise funds and have impact. Yes. Yeah, I was always a bit puzzled why all this animosity.
Right.
Also, in the Netherlands, the salaries are not necessarily better. Administrative justice, full professors get more.
Yeah.
So I go down and read I do all this work for leading politicians who try to introduce new programs, set up victim assistance programs, crime prevention programs. Why all this negativity? And in particular, I felt in a way treated not fairly if you compare it to other sciences. If you are an economist and you spend some years as an advisor to the government, everyone thinks that's great.
Right, that's a good point.
But not in our field.
Yeah.
For criminologists, you're not supposed to do that. I hope we can overcome that as a discipline, because it's self-defeating. I don't see the rationale for it, unless you work in an undemocratic Latin American country 20 years ago, where indeed you shouldn't work with the criminal justice system, you should stay out.
Yeah.
But that was never the case in my view in the Netherlands.
Right. And it's so hard to break in, and that's why that historical period where both with the Dutch government and in the UK, because as you know, ministries of justice often work, at least in my opinion, like a public law firm, and they're there to, protect citizens by prosecuting cases, and that's the approach. But for them to reach the point to say, well, the prosecution approach is great, but it's not solving our larger problem of crime, and that we have to turn elsewhere to get some expertise in here to help us on this. I mean, that's just was such an important threshold for the movement, I think, of criminology as a discipline.
And it wasn't, maybe that's now a little bit forgotten history, but also in the US, you had this law enforcement assistance agency.
Yeah.
Wasn't it?
Administration.
For the same reasons. They felt we have this right, but violent crime was the issue, I think, in the US. They set up a big commission with academics in it, and they advised a special program to innovate the approaches to crime. The same happened in the US. It's a bit earlier, I think, than in Europe.
Yes.
But it's the same phenomenon.
Right, but without the same results. You could argue.
Well, it was rapidly politically abused, I think, in the US, because they appointed people that had no interest in their own program. I remember that.
Yeah.
I remember
and that's what happened. So there were some good reports, some good
They
ideas.
invested the money for researching, buying more bullet vests.
Yeah, this becomes a problem, right? Everybody thinks in terms of solutions rather than researching the problem. And so there's always an immediate push, we must do something. When the U.S. passed its anti-human trafficking law in the year 2000, same kind of thing, the immediate push, we have to do something. And what happens in many countries, including the U.S., well, immediately we have to do programs, or we have to train police, we have to train conservative providers, but we really don't know what to train them to do because we've done no baseline research on the nature and extent of the problem. Who are these victims? Who are these offenders? What is the nature of human trafficking operations? And so what tends to happen is that the money is spent on programs without an empirical basis for those programs. And it seems in the Netherlands, in UK, and a few other places, there's just been a little bit more of an empirical approach. That is a willingness to say, all right, we see the value of generating some data on which we will base our decisions, on which we will base our programs.
Not everywhere in Europe, but certainly in the UK, in the Scandinavian countries, in the Netherlands. Already when you are in France, it becomes quite different.
Yeah.
There is no tradition at all to do empirical work before you launch a new political agenda. They don't need facts in those parts of Europe.
Right.
And so there are huge divides between the North and South.
Right, and I often wonder, because as an academic, we train students to be empirically minded. That's probably the most important thing we train them to do. You know, don't be led by ideology, be led by the evidence. And you see, we can't seem to get our, get governments on board to think that way. Never mind citizens. So you have a lot of ideologically driven policy and programs rather than empirically driven policy and programs. And I often wondered, well, why in Northern Europe do they see that so much more clearly than in many other places? I don't know. Is it a cultural thing? I just don't. You would think it'd be more universal than it is.
It becomes very philosophical. But for the Netherlands, I can say with some real conviction that the Dutch are traders. So if there is no profit in it, there can be a lot of ideology, but if at the end of the day there is no result, tangible results, you cannot sell it that easy to the Dutch. That's also why the Dutch have this tradition of tolerance. To be intolerant is not usually adding up too much. I mean, there are not that many benefits in being very intolerant to people who have another sexual orientation or religion.
Right.
And so that's the trading tradition.
I see. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
And that makes you interested in facts. Well, trading is about facts, much more than about. There is no ideology-driven business. I think that's not possible. So I think that makes the trading tradition of the Dutch and the Brits probably is part of the explanation. And that is less important for the French culture. They were a big empire by themselves.
Yeah.
Even without the Dutch trade, they were self-sustained. They were economically. That might be well.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah,
Some Jews.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's true. It's how culture becomes political philosophy, I guess, down the road. Now, at this point in your career, you're working on a number of things. I see you're involved with human trafficking as Council of Europe. And what are you doing in that capacity?
I'm on the monitoring board of the Anti-Human Trafficking Convention of the Council of Europe. And this is broader than the European Union. This is 40 countries. So I visit 3-4 countries per year for a week with a colleague and with people from the Secretariat, and we interview people from the NGO community and then from the police, the prosecutors, the judges, to get a feeling of how they are implementing or to what extent they are not implementing the treaty obligations. And then we publish a report, which is in the public domain. And they are not that diplomatic. they really put some fingers on the sore spots here and there. So that is interesting work, because I very much believe that if you have a treaty, then you should have serious monitoring. Otherwise, it's a facade. It's a free lunch. Then it's not a treaty.
Yeah.
So I'm very motivated for that work. And I love Strasbourg because it has a very nice human rights orientation. It's quite unlike other international organizations. They have the Human Rights Board in Strasbourg. That's the palace in Strasbourg. So I like to be there and work there. I also try to use my experiences there as an evaluator now for academic work. So I presented a paper here this week on an index that I have designed based on the reports of the monitoring body, the quantitative index. So I give scores to all the countries. I do that not in the name of the Council of Europe, but under my own name.
Right.
I think it's interesting work to try to have a performance measure for the criminal justice policies of a country. And I think it can be done.
Right, so this way, your evaluation would become a little bit more standardized, and it makes sense. And you have done other work in trying to quantify organized crime and develop indexes because organized crime, because it's such an amorphous type of criminal behavior, people tend to conceptualize it differently. But your index, which you have written widely about, to me is another way of accomplishing that. That is, can we get more universal indicators so we can compare our progress across jurisdictions?
And do an analytical work. If you have a quantitative measure, that opens many more opportunities for rigorous analysis. More than for exchanging anecdotes about what goes on. And what I find very rewarding is, apart from the recognition from colleagues, is that this part of my work has really caught the attention of a young economist. I get emails almost on a weekly basis from all over the world about this part of my work. Because the young economists, they are interested in these issues, and they find nothing because they can't work with anecdotes, legal and anecdote. They want numbers, and then they come to some of my publications, and they are surprised. They say, this is something we can work with. So I hope that there is also a younger generation who takes continue that work.
And I do think that is going to be one of the lasting legacies of your work, because if you look from victimization surveys all the way through, organized crime and human trafficking and all the areas that you worked in, to me, one of the underlying themes from reading what you've written is that you're always looking to quantify and standardize so we can talk about something in objective terms. And I think your contributions to empirical criminology in that sense have been pretty dramatic.
I can't say I agree with the last statement, but that I have always this search for, can we quantify here? Everyone says, of course, it cannot be done. That motivates me very much to push myself and see whether a way can be found to have indicators, and I think we can still quantify much more than we do in criminology. There is still a reluctance within the field compared to economics or medical science. Maybe less so in the United States, but in Europe and even in the UK, the quantitative criminology is still a minor school.
Right. And one of the things holding it back, you might say, why aren't there more people globally working on organized crime issues, you could say, because we haven't been very good at quantifying the phenomenon itself. And until you get measures that you can standardize and compare across jurisdictions, people say, well, I'm not going to go near that. I'm going to go near something that I can measure. Because, measurement in every field is the fundamental thing. In criminology, we've just been a little bit slower in some places in our quest to measure better.
Yes. Well, and I think in that respect, certainly the American criminology is more at the frontier than European criminology.
Right.
It's more of a tradition to quantify.
That's right. And then, of course, within there, we could always talk about some things you quantify. A lot of the current debate, you feel, okay, we're quantifying, but you don't want to always simplify the phenomenon while you quantify. And this is a as you know, a major issue.
Yeah, there is the Einstein. Not everything that you can count really counts. Right.
Right. So
Yeah, I agree with that.
yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely, I agree with that. But sometimes you can.
So sometimes and sometimes my team is also finding their way. And that's where I think the contributions of you with the human trafficking and organized crime and other things, saying, well, there's a different way to conceptualize this. If we want to look at organized crime, we just don't count, conspiracies. We look at other things. We look at corruption, and we put a few variables together. And
Dead bodies that are never solved, but that's one of my indicators. Homicides that are never solved. I mean, if that goes up in a country, it's a marker.
Right.
That the mafia is on the
Right.
rise. I think that's really
Right.
confirmed.
And to me, the inside of that is saying, well, there's other ways to measure. We just haven't been creative enough in thinking about it.
Looking for the markers.
Right.
Yes.
Looking for the markers and looking for correlates to see if we can combine them together into some kind of useful index. So that I think is a very big contribution, because that will lead, as you find with your emails from economists and others, more people to study the phenomenon, saying, okay, yeah, I think that this conception makes some sense. I wonder if we apply it to my country or wherever they are, and then you get some interesting work being done.
Yes.
So but it's that thought work at the beginning that isn't as common around the world, as it ought to be. Because you can't just say, well, organized crime, well, that's just, but according to the UN Convention, 2 or more people who do this. Well, that's not, I guess, that's not empirically useful. So you need someone to say, okay, well, what does this get us if we're trying to control organized crime? So I think your empirical approach to most things that you've written about is arguably, your largest contribution. As people, and you are one of the discoverers of modern criminology, I guess we will call it. So this is very good. So when you look at your career, and you're still writing, you're still presenting papers, you're still doing all kinds of work. Do you have any other directions you think you might be going in, or things that you're thinking about now?
Other than keep quantifying the human trafficking, I have plans for a book on that. I want to have a second edition of The World of Crime and try to involve others in that exercise, because it's a lot of work to bring all the numbers together. What I have also worked on, and this is not so well known outside the victimology circle, is why do we call victims victims? That has been a theme that I've worked on. And I found out that we call victims victims in all Western languages. Victims meaning a sacrificed animal, but not in the Chinese language and not in all the non-Western languages. So why do we call victims victims? That was the theme of my inaugural lecture in Tilburg, and I'm still working on that. With also with people from the Islamic world to find out why all these Western languages use this term, and I think it refers to Jesus Christ, that we recognize in victims the suffering of Jesus Christ. So that's, and in a way, it's a discovery,
right?
Because that has never been discussed.
No, not at all.
By any philosopher or even in theology. And I have become more and more convinced that this is indeed why we call victims victims. We recognize the passion of Christ. And it's not that old. It comes up in the 17th century in all these languages. And in China, they sacrificed animal. Why? No, that the person who's harmed by the crime. There is absolutely no connotation with sacrifice at all. It's purely Christian. And what's fascinating, and that's one of my last publications, with an Iranian young criminologist, is that in the Arab language they call a victim a korban, and they have other terms for it, and that also means the sacrificed animal. So that doesn't make sense. So I was struggling with that, but now I found out that is fairly recent. They only did that in the 20th century, and they simply translated text from French and English on victims' rights, and then they said victim, we looked in the dictionary, and then they said, oh, that's a korban, without any of the ideological context that it has in the Christian culture. So that is, it's also empirical research, but it's dictionaries and not survey research. But that is still something that fascinates me. A lot, because it is not just an interesting fact that we call victims for that reason, but it also has implications, I think, for our attitudes towards victims. There is a whole agenda there. If you use the label that was used for Jesus Christ for citizens that have become harmed by crime, that brings in a whole set of associations. So I'm working on that as well, and I will continue to do that.
Well, that's fascinating. Yes. It's
something else.
It's a point of philosophy as well.
It's
all the knowledge.
It's disconnected from it. That cannot be quantified.
No,
but it's fascinating.
It is. All right. Well, Jan van Dijk, thank you very much for joining us on the Oral History interview, and we look forward to your continued work. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.